I've started a new channel called Lunila Tales. Please subscribe and watch my best stories there. Link is in the description. The galaxy laughed when she promised she would never kill again. They laughed louder when she chose diplomacy over destruction, trading her blades for speeches and her war mask for silken robes. They did not laugh tonight. Tonight they would remember her name. The orchestra's notes died in a strangled screech as masked mercenaries stormed the gala hall, weapons raised, faces hidden behind mirrored visors. The chandeliers above trembled with the impact of boots and gunfire. Guests screamed and scattered, pearls spilling across the marble floor like frozen stars. And in the middle of it all, her son was torn from her arms. Cale was only 16, still awkward in his formal suit, his hair refusing to obey the comb she had forced upon him. He had been complaining about being bored not 3 minutes earlier, tugging at his collar and whispering sarcastic jokes about the endless speeches. He had even managed to make her smile, though she tried to keep her composure as the galaxy's most celebrated diplomat. Then the mercenaries struck, and his humor died on his lips. 2 of them grabbed him, one pressing a blaster to his temple. Lyra froze. She raised her hands, her voice cutting through the chaos, steady and commanding. She told them to let him go, that she would give them anything. They only laughed, one of them snarling that her words had no weight here. They dragged Cale toward the shattered doors as his eyes locked on hers, wide and terrified, pleading silently. She took a step forward and was slammed back by the butt of a rifle. Blood filled her mouth. The boy was gone in seconds. Silence fell over the ruined hall once the mercenaries had departed. The galaxy's elite stood dumbfounded, jewels glittering uselessly as they whispered in fear. Some recorded the scene on their holopads, already broadcasting the humiliation of the great Lyra Drax. A diplomat, powerless to protect her own child. She heard the words like poison dripping in her ears. Weak, helpless, finished. The transmission came minutes later. The mercenaries' leader appeared as a grainy projection above the broken stage, Cale bound and gagged at his feet. The voice was distorted, mocking. "Surrender Irinder's treaty rights," he said. "Dismantle the accords she had fought years to establish. Do this and the boy might live. Refuse and his death would be broadcast across the stars." Then the projection winked out, leaving the hall in stunned silence. A senator coughed into his hand, muttering that perhaps it was best to consider negotiation. Another wrung her hands and murmured about sacrifice for the greater good. Lyra stared at them all, and for the first time in years, she felt the old darkness stir in her blood. She left the hall without a word, her footsteps echoing through the abandoned corridors of the embassy. In her private quarters, she ignored the mirrored walls and the soft diplomatic trappings. She approached the locked cabinet hidden behind layers of encryption, a relic she had sworn never to open again. Her fingers hovered over the panel, trembling, before she entered the code. The cabinet hissed open, releasing the faint scent of oil and metal. Inside lay the tools of a forgotten life. Blasters polished to a cold gleam. Knives that had tasted the blood of tyrants and innocents alike. Armor blacker than the void, scarred but intact. And in a sealed case, a chip containing records the galaxy believed erased. Missions, body counts, battles fought in shadow. 7,000 confirmed kills. 7,000 souls that haunted her when she closed her eyes at night. She stared at the arsenal, her reflection fractured across its deadly surfaces. She remembered the years she spent earning those numbers, the nights when blood coated her hands, the screams that followed her into dreams. She had buried that woman, convinced the galaxy and herself that Lyra Drax was only a diplomat now, a voice for peace. But they had taken her son. They had torn from her the one anchor that kept the darkness chained. She picked up the blade first, feeling its weight settle into her palm like an old friend. Then the armor, the plates snapping into place with a hiss. She looked once more at the holoscreen where Cale's terrified eyes stared back at her, frozen in the mercenaries' broadcast. Her lips curled into something that was neither smile nor snarl. In the distance, the city of lights still blazed, unaware that history had just shifted. The galaxy would believe she would plead and beg, that she would negotiate and bargain. They would expect her to send envoys, to assemble committees, to draft treaties dripping with concessions. They did not know what she had hidden. They did not remember the name she once carried. But soon they would. She closed the cabinet, sealing away the weapons she did not carry, locking it forever behind her. What she had taken was enough. Enough to remind them. Enough to start again. She whispered to the empty room, her voice low and sharp, carrying the weight of every soul she had ever taken. You took the wrong boy. Then she turned, armor gleaming, blade at her side, and walked out into the night. Somewhere beyond the stars, Kale was waiting. Somewhere beyond the stars, the galaxy was about to remember its most terrible secret. The woman they had mocked as powerless was the most dangerous predator they had ever unleashed. And this time, she was not fighting for treaties or survival. She was fighting for her son. The stars outside the embassy shimmered like a million watching eyes. If they had any sense, they would tremble. The stars streaked into lines as Lyra's stolen fighter tore free from Arinder's atmosphere, alarms screaming in protest at her reckless launch. The ship's assigned pilot had tried to stop her, stammering that the ambassador could not simply hijack military property. She had answered by slamming him against the hangar wall with one hand and striding past, the sleek craft already whispering promises of war. Now the vessel shuddered under her control, its controls responding as if it remembered her touch. Once she had flown machines like this into battlefields that burned entire systems. Now she flew into the dark, chasing the faintest trail of those who had dared to take her son. Back on the planet, the senators and delegates would already be wringing their hands, forming committees and drafting statements about appropriate diplomatic measures. They would call her reckless, unfit, dangerous. Let them. They had never seen the things she had seen, never counted corpses in the thousands, never felt a child's hand slip from their grasp as mercenaries laughed in their faces. Words would not bring Kale back. Words would not stop the ones who had taken him. Only action. Only blood. Her first lead came from the fighter's tactical computer, which intercepted a coded mercenary transmission. Their ship had refueled at a fringe outpost 2 sectors away. She plotted the jump, but fuel reserves warned she would not reach it without resupply. That meant a stop, and a stop meant exposing herself to the kind of people she had avoided for decades. Old contacts, old debt. The kind of places where her name was whispered in half awe and half terror. She smiled bitterly. Perhaps they needed a reminder that Lyra Drax was not just a diplomat. The outpost she chose was called Draven's Pit, a lawless station spinning drunkenly in the orbit of a dead moon. Lights flickered as if powered by dying lungs, the docking bay thick with the stench of oil, smoke, and desperation. Armed guards slouched against walls, but they straightened the moment her boots hit the deck. She was armored, faceless behind a mask that mirrored their own. Yet something in her stride made them step aside without a word. Predators recognize predators. Inside the main concourse, noise battered her ears. Merchants shouted over the clamor of gamblers, drunks, and smugglers. A fight broke out at a table of cards, someone screamed, and nobody cared. She walked past them all until she reached a small stall lit by neon wires, where a wiry alien with 4 arms polished weapons that had no business being sold openly. His wide yellow eyes flicked up at her, and his mouth stretched into something like a grin. So, the ambassador finally remembered her friends. Lyra removed her mask. The alien, named Tovek, dropped the weapon in his hand, nearly impaling his own foot. He stammered that he had heard rumors, that the great diplomat had gone soft, that she was busy saving galaxies with her words. She told him she needed fuel and information. When he tried to haggle, she slammed a blade into the counter so hard it split the surface. She whispered that her son had been taken, and the air itself seemed to recoil. Tovek swallowed his words, handed her a data chip, and muttered that mercenaries had passed through only hours ago, heading toward the syndicate lanes. She asked who they worked for. He shook his head violently and said some names were too dangerous to speak, even here. She left him trembling in silence. She could not do this alone, not entirely. Some battles required allies, even if only temporary ones. She made her way deeper into the underbelly of the station, where the stench grew worse and the lights dimmed until shadows seemed alive. There she found an old acquaintance, a mechanic who had once patched up her ships back in her assassin days. Griv, a three-eyed being with grease-stained hands, squinted at her in disbelief. He cracked a grin that showed too many teeth and said he thought she had retired into peace speeches. She told him Peace had just been murdered. He laughed nervously, then offered his services if she promised not to kill him for his sarcasm. His humor was irritating, but his skills would prove useful. She accepted. The next step was finding the mercenary supply ship. With Griv's hacking and the stolen chip from Tovek, they tracked the vessel to the far edge of the sector, drifting like a fattened insect. Lyra attacked without hesitation. The fighters screamed out of hyperspace, cannons blazing, tearing into the supply ship's shields before alarms could fully register. Her eyes burned with cold precision as she darted between turret fire, every move a deadly dance she had not forgotten. She punched through the hole with a boarding clamp and entered alone, blade in hand. The mercenaries inside were not prepared. They had heard of her reputation as a negotiator, not as a killer. The first two died before they drew their weapons, their blood smearing across bulkheads. The third begged for mercy, and she knocked him unconscious rather than cut him down. She was not a butcher anymore. Not completely. She tore through the ship, leaving fear in her wake, until she reached the captain's quarters. The man inside was shaking as he tried to load his blaster. She slammed him to the wall, pressed the blade against his throat, and demanded to know where her son had been taken. He sputtered out that the boy was headed to a fortress above the storm world of Velkaron, escorted by forces far beyond mere mercenaries. He spoke a name then, a name Lyra had not heard in years. Senator Havek. Her mind reeled. Havek, the very man she had once saved from assassination, who had risen to power on her protection. She had thought him loyal, thought him indebted. And now he had betrayed her, using her son as a pawn. She let the captain live, shoving him aside with a final warning that if she ever crossed his path again, his lungs would be the next thing to bleed. He collapsed in sobbing relief. Lyra walked away without looking back, her armor glinting in the dim light. She returned to her fighter, the data echoing in her mind. The galaxy thought of Havek as charming, wise, and incorruptible. Now she knew the truth. He had aligned with mercenaries, risked the treaty, and stolen her son. She set her course toward Velkaron, her jaw set like steel. The storm world awaited, and with it, the fortress where Kale was held. Her allies might be liars, cowards, and criminals, but they would follow her because they feared her more than they feared death. As the stars stretched once more into endless lines, Lyra whispered to herself the same words she had spoken in the embassy. "You took the wrong boy." Only now, the words carried more than a promise of violence. They carried the certainty that the galaxy itself would burn if it stood in her way. Velkaron's orbit shimmered with storms so vast they reached into space, violent ribbons of lightning cracking through the void. Lyra's fighter trembled as she approached, sensors groaning under the interference. Somewhere within that chaos lay the fortress. It was no ordinary prison. Havek had poured resources into building a station that was as much symbol as stronghold, a floating monument of power, gleaming towers wrapped in shields powered by the planet's storms. It looked untouchable, a citadel daring anyone to challenge it. Lyra did not hesitate. Untouchable had never been a word that stopped her before. Her ship clung to the shadows of a shattered moon as she waited. Griv's voice buzzed in her ear, smug as always, reporting that his stolen codes might get her through the outer defenses if she did not mind alarms blaring afterward. Lyra muttered that she never minded alarms. The mechanic laughed nervously and said she was terrifying, then quickly asked if she needed him alive for much longer. She told him she would need him until Kale was free, and after that, His fate depended on whether his jokes grew less irritating. He groaned and got back to his hacking. While she waited for the window, she watched the news feeds pouring across the sector. Her disappearance had not gone unnoticed. Every outlet screamed with speculation. Some claimed she had collapsed from grief, others that she had resigned in shame. A few whispered rumors of something darker, stories dredged up from old archives about the woman who had been called the Butcher of Veyros. Comedians mocked her on late-night shows, portraying her as a diplomat wielding flowers against guns. Yet underground channels told a different tale. Whispers spread of a ghost returning, a predator stalking the stars once more. Both stories fed the fire, and both kept her enemies guessing. Lyra allowed herself a grim smile. Let them wonder. Fear was its own weapon. The name of Havoc gnawed at her thoughts as she studied the fortress. Once, years ago, she had saved him from an assassin's blade. She had dragged him bleeding through fire and smoke, cut down his enemies, and secured his rise to the Senate. He had looked at her with gratitude then, promising loyalty, promising that her sacrifice would not be forgotten. She should have known better. Power never remembered debts. It only remembered opportunities. Now he had found his. By taking Kale, Havoc had baited her into the open, knowing the galaxy would be forced to watch. It was a political game, a trap layered in shadows and spectacle. But if Havoc thought she would play by the rules of politics, he had forgotten who she was. The waiting ended when her sensors caught movement. Not a fleet, but a single ship. Sleek, deadly, familiar. It slid from the fortress like a serpent from its nest. At first she thought it was another patrol. Then her breath caught as recognition struck. That ship belonged to Jin Vero. The name carried memories of 100 skirmishes, duels in the dark, missions where they had been rivals and sometimes reluctant allies. Jin, the assassin who had once sworn to kill her and had nearly succeeded more than once. If Jin was here, Havoc had reached deeper into her past than she feared. The encounter came fast. Jin's ship cut across hers, weapons locking. Lyra braced, ready for a fight that would scorch the orbit with fire. Instead, Jin's voice crackled through her comms, laced with familiar mockery. "Still alive, are you? I thought you were playing house with the politicians." Lyra answered coldly that she was done playing house. Jin laughed, low and sharp, and said the galaxy was buzzing with rumors of her return, that some believed she had gone soft. Lyra asked if Jin planned to test that theory. Jin hesitated, then admitted she had no love for Havoc either. He had used her too, dangled contracts, pulled strings, and now she was as trapped as Lyra in his games. For a moment, old enmities shifted into something else. Not trust, not forgiveness, but necessity. They arranged a meeting aboard a drifting cargo hulk, its hull scarred from battles long forgotten. Inside, the air was stale, lights flickering. Jin stood waiting, armored in matte black, blades at her sides, eyes glittering with challenge. The years had not dulled her edge. They circled each other, old instincts rising, trading barbs as sharp as knives. Jin quipped that Lyra still fought like a drunk droid, and Lyra retorted that Jin still talked too much. For a heartbeat, it almost felt like the old days, when they measured each other not by words but by steel. Then the moment passed, and they turned their attention to the fortress. Information spilled between them like uneasy truce offerings. Jin had been inside. She had seen Kale, alive but under guard. Havoc intended to use him not only as leverage against Lyra but as a stage prop, a symbol of her failure, a weapon to sway treaties in his favor. He planned to broadcast Kale's execution if she resisted, ensuring the galaxy would see her destroyed. Lyra's fists clenched at the thought. Her son was not a pawn, not a message, not a tool. He was hers. And anyone who forgot that would pay in blood. Jin proposed they work together, just long enough to get inside. Lyra's eyes narrowed, suspicion burning. But the logic was sound. Alone, she could breach the fortress, but she would lose too much time, too much ground. With Jin's inside knowledge, their chances grew sharper. The truce was sealed with silence, no handshake, No words of loyalty. Only the knowledge that both wanted to see Havoc bleed. Before they departed, Jin asked why Lyra had waited so long to return to her old self. Why pretend to be something she was not? Lyra answered without hesitation. Because Kale deserved a mother who did not wake with blood on her hands. He deserved to believe she was more than the sum of her kills. Jin tilted her head, a shadow of something almost like respect flickering in her eyes. Then she smirked and said maybe motherhood had made her more dangerous. Lyra allowed herself the faintest smile before she turned away. Together, they returned to their ships, setting course for the fortress. The storm world crackled below them, lightning splitting the darkness, as if the planet itself raged in sympathy with what was coming. Lyra's heart beat like war drums in her chest. The galaxy thought this was a game of politics, a clash of words and treaties. Havoc thought he had caged her. But she was not caged. She was sharpening her claws. And soon, the fortress would learn what it meant to stand between a mother and her child. The plan to breach the fortress was reckless even by Lyra's standards. It was a structure designed to be impenetrable, hanging above Velkaron's storms like a crown of iron. Shields powered by the raging atmosphere encased it in a shimmering veil, while turrets bristled along every surface like the spines of some vast predator. Yet here she was, standing in the hold of a battered freighter with Jin and the others, sketching out what could generously be called a strategy. The group that had assembled around her was far from an elite strike team. Griv the mechanic wiped his greasy hands on his stained coat, muttering about how much he hated electricity and shields and death. A gambler named Solon leaned against a crate, flipping a coin and swearing that luck was a skill. And then there was their pilot, a nervous man called Fesk, who had already asked 3 times if it was too late to run. Jin sat sharpening her blade in silence, smirking whenever someone voiced their doubts. It was not a crew built for trust, but it was the one she had. Lyra outlined the approach with cold precision. They would slip in under the cover of the storms, using Griv's stolen access codes to bypass the shields temporarily. Once inside, Fesk would keep the freighter hovering near the maintenance docks, ready for extraction if everything went wrong. Which, as Solon pointed out with a grin, it certainly would. Jin was to lead the assault team with Lyra, carving through whatever resistance they faced. Their goal was not subtlety but speed. They had to reach Kale before Havoc decided to turn his threat into spectacle. Every minute counted. Lyra's voice was steady, but inside, her blood pounded. She could already picture Kale's face, trapped and waiting. The storms of Velkaron welcomed them with violence. Lightning ripped across the void, illuminating the fortress in bursts of blue fire. The freighter bucked and groaned, alarms blaring as winds dragged it like a toy. Fesk cursed with every breath, gripping the controls as if sheer terror might keep them alive. Solon, unfazed, kept flipping his coin, each catch punctuated with a lazy grin. Jin stood beside Lyra at the viewport, eyes gleaming with anticipation. She muttered that this felt almost nostalgic. Lyra ignored the comment, focusing on the fortress growing larger by the second. When the shields shimmered before them, Griv yelped from the control panel, shouting that his codes were working, though only for a short window. Lyra told Fesk to punch the engines, and the freighter plunged through the veil just as it flickered open. The docking bay was chaos from the moment they landed. Their entry triggered alarms despite Griv's protests, and armed guards poured in, weapons raised. Lyra moved first, her blade flashing as she cut down the front line before the guards even realized who they were facing. Jin followed close, spinning her twin blades in arcs of death, her laughter echoing in the steel chamber. Solon drew a blaster and fired with unnerving accuracy, casually calling out the odds of each shot hitting as though he were still at a gambling table. Griv crouched behind cover, swearing he was only good with machines and begging the universe not to let him be shot. Fesk stayed at the freighter, screaming into the comms that he had no intention of leaving the ship because someone had to fly them out. The fight was loud, brutal, and short. When it was over, the floor was slick with blood, and Lyra's chest heaved with the thrill of combat she had tried so hard to bury. They advanced deeper into the fortress, alarms blaring across every corridor. The plan had shifted from infiltration to survival, but Lyra had expected that. Subtlety had never been her strongest weapon. Fear was. Every guard who saw her approach faltered for a moment, recognition dawning as the whispers spread. The Butcher of Veyros had returned. She cut through them with mechanical precision, leaving bodies sprawled in her wake. Jin fought at her side, matching her strike for strike, their movements weaving together in a deadly rhythm forged through years of rivalry. Even Solon, reckless gambler that he was, kept firing with unnerving calm, humming a tune under his breath as if the chaos amused him. It was Kale's cell that changed everything. When Lyra finally forced open the reinforced door, her breath caught at the sight of him. He was thinner, his face pale, but his eyes still held that spark she knew too well. He rushed forward at the sight of her, chains clattering at his wrists, but he was not alone. A boy, younger than Kale and dressed in the uniform of Havek's cadets, stood by his side. The cadet's eyes were wide with fear, but he did not run. Kale spoke quickly, telling her that the cadet had helped him survive, had smuggled him food, had shielded him from the worst of the guards. Lyra's relief turned to ice when Kale shook his head fiercely and said he would not leave without the cadet. He had risked everything for me, Kale insisted, and I will not abandon him. For a heartbeat, Lyra wanted to argue. Every second they lingered was a second Havek drew the noose tighter. But when she looked into her son's eyes, she saw the same fire that had once burned in her own. Kale had made his choice, and she would not break him by denying it. She freed them both, cutting through the chains with a swift strike. The cadet stared at her in awe, whispering that he had heard the stories, that he never believed she was real. Lyra almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. She told him that reality was far worse than stories. Their escape did not go smoothly. A squad of heavily armed soldiers intercepted them at the hangar, blasters raised. At their head stood an officer who sneered when he saw her. He shouted that Havek had predicted this, that she would come crawling, and that her son would be paraded before the galaxy as her failure. Lyra's blood boiled at the words. Without hesitation, she surged forward, her blade cutting down the officer before his sneer could fade. The squad broke under her fury, scattered like dry leaves in a storm. Jin finished the stragglers with cold efficiency, while Solon provided cover fire, muttering that the odds of surviving this were shrinking by the second. But survival was not the only challenge. As they fled back toward the freighter, Kale stopped her with a single word. "Mother." His voice was quiet, but it froze her in place. He looked at her not with fear but with knowledge. He told her he knew what she had been, what the galaxy whispered about the Butcher of Veyros. He had seen the bodies she left behind in their escape. He did not hate her. He did not even flinch. But his eyes carried a weight that pierced deeper than any blade. He asked if she would lose herself again, if she would let the blood consume her until nothing remained. The freighter rattled through the storm as if the planet itself were trying to tear it apart. Fesk cursed every second at the controls, sweating so much it looked like he had stepped out of a rainstorm. Lightning flared across the viewport, bright enough to blind, but Lyra's mind was not on the storm. Her thoughts were on the betrayal that had led them here. Havek had orchestrated all of it, the kidnapping, the fortress, the political trap. He had counted on her rage, on her breaking her own vows to reveal the monster beneath the Diplomat's mask. Now the galaxy was watching. The fortress attack had been broadcast across a dozen hidden channels, twisted by Havek's agents into propaganda. Lyra Drax, returning to her bloody past. Lyra Drax, slaughtering her way through peacekeepers. The Butcher of Veyros reborn. And yet, for every voice that condemned her, others whispered in awe. The galaxy was dividing, one half recoiling in fear, the other hungry for a legend's return. In the cargo hold, Kale sat quietly with the young cadet at his side, his gaze fixed on her. He had not spoken much since their escape, but his silence was heavy, pressing down on her more than any accusation could. She saw questions in his eyes. Did she regret unleashing death again? Did she enjoy it? Would she stop once he was safe, or had something been set loose inside her that would never be caged again? Lyra could not answer. She turned her attention to Jin instead, who leaned against the wall cleaning her blades with the same casual calm as if they were still in a smoky tavern between contracts. Jin caught her staring and smirked, saying it looked like old times, except now Lyra had picked up the habit of adopting strays. Lyra shot her a cold look, but Jin only laughed. Old rivalries had turned into a truce, but the edge between them was still sharp. Griv appeared from beneath a panel, covered in grease and muttering that the ship was barely holding together. He complained loudly that if they wanted to keep fighting an entire galactic senator's army, they might consider getting something sturdier than a freighter patched with prayers and duct tape. Solon, flipping his coin as usual, muttered that the odds of survival were still in their favor, barely, though his smirk suggested even he did not believe it. The banter filled the silence, but it was fragile, a thin shield against the storm of fear waiting outside. The storm eased only when the freighter slipped into orbit around a nameless asteroid cluster. There, hidden in the shadows, they regrouped. Lyra pored over stolen data from the fortress, her jaw tightening as she pieced together Havek's plan. He was not content with using Kale as leverage. He wanted spectacle. In 3 days, during the summit of the Outer Rim systems, Havek planned to parade Kale as proof of her weakness, broadcasting his execution across the galaxy if she refused his demand. Worse, he intended to frame her as a traitor, a war criminal returning to her true nature, forcing the Senate to strip her of every political tie. It was a perfect trap, one designed to destroy her legacy and her son in one stroke. Lyra's hands clenched around the datapad until the screen cracked. If Havek wanted spectacle, then she would give him one that would eclipse his own. The decision was made quickly. They would strike the summit directly. It was suicide, Fesk whined, pointing out that the summit would be guarded by fleets, armies, and enough security to repel an invasion. Lyra said they were not invading. They were cutting straight to the heart. Jin grinned, saying she liked the sound of that. Solon tossed his coin and declared that impossible odds were the only odds worth playing. Griv groaned so loudly that the ship echoed with it, but he set to work anyway, muttering that if he died, he wanted everyone to know it was their fault. Kale stood then, his voice steady for the first time. He told her he wanted to fight too. Lyra froze at his words, her heart lurching. He was her son, still young, still carrying the innocence she had tried to protect. Yet his eyes were unshakable. She told him he was not ready, that he had already endured enough. He looked at her with quiet defiance and said he was not asking permission. The cadet beside him nodded, echoing his determination. For a moment, Lyra saw herself in him, and it frightened her. The summit was chaos before they even arrived. Havek had filled the skies above the neutral station with warships, banners flying, broadcasts prepared. Every channel in the galaxy buzzed with anticipation. This was to be his masterpiece, his chance to show that even the most feared warrior turned diplomat could be broken. But when the freighter slipped into the system under the cover of forged codes, Havek's narrative began to unravel. Lyra and her crew boarded the station in a storm of blaster fire. The corridors rang with screams and the metallic clash of steel. Lyra fought like a force of nature, every strike calculated, every kill clean and merciless. Jin danced beside her, blades flashing, cutting down soldiers with effortless grace. Solon laughed as he fired, announcing the odds of each shot as if the chaos were only another game. Griv cursed constantly but kept systems disabled and doors forced open. Even Fesk, terrified though he was, managed to hold the ship steady as their escape route. The broadcast that Havek had planned so carefully became his undoing. Lyra seized control of the station's comms, her voice and image spreading across the galaxy. She did not speak like a diplomat. She spoke like the warrior she had once been, declaring Havoc a traitor, exposing his corruption, his betrayal of treaties, and his attempt to use her son as leverage. She did not plead for mercy or understanding. She promised retribution. She promised that anyone who raised their hand against her family would face the same fate as the 7,000 before them. The galaxy listened, horrified and enthralled, as the legend of the Butcher of Varos became flesh before their eyes. The fighting grew bloodier. Havoc, furious that his perfect script had been stolen, ordered Kale dragged onto the broadcast platform in chains. Soldiers hauled him forward, shoving him to his knees as Havoc raised a blade for the cameras. Lyra saw it from across the chamber, her heart seizing as if the world itself had stopped. She screamed his name, her voice cutting through the roar of battle. Havoc smiled into the cameras, shouting that this was the proof of her failure. Then Kale moved. In the chaos, in the moment Havoc thought him broken, Kale snatched the cadet's weapon hidden at his side and drove it upward. The blade sank into Havoc's chest, cutting his words into silence. The galaxy watched as the senator staggered, blood staining his robes, disbelief etched on his face. It was not Lyra who struck the killing blow. It was her son. The chamber erupted into pandemonium. Havoc's soldiers faltered as their leader fell, chaos tearing through their ranks. Lyra reached Kale, pulling him into her arms even as the cadet stood beside them, pale but resolute. She met Jint's eyes across the battlefield, and for once there was no smirk, only a nod of respect. The tide of the battle shifted. The summit had become a battlefield, and the galaxy had seen the truth live and unedited. Havoc was dead. The Butcher of Varos had returned. And the boy they thought upon had proven himself more than anyone expected. The chamber where Havoc fell was still echoing with the sound of chaos. Blaster fire crackled against walls, smoke thickened the air, and the metallic scent of blood clung to every breath. Kale knelt beside her, his chest heaving, the blade he had used to strike Havoc's heart trembling in his hands. For a moment the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Cameras still hovered above, broadcasting everything live to millions of systems. They had all seen the boy's act, the senator's collapse, the moment power shifted from one hand to another. Lyra placed her palm over Kale's trembling fingers, lowering the blade slowly before pulling him into her arms. He was shaking, but his eyes did not look away from hers. There was no regret there, only the heavy realization of what he had done and what it meant. She whispered into his ear that he had done what was necessary, that he had chosen survival over fear. The weight of her words settled over him like armor. The soldiers loyal to Havoc faltered, their formation collapsing without their leader's command. Some dropped their weapons outright, backing away from the woman whose legend had returned to life before their eyes. Others fought on, too frightened or too loyal to stop. Lyra rose to her feet, blade flashing as she cut through the ones who dared approach. Jin was at her side, spinning through the melee like a shadow made of steel, her laughter carrying over the screams of soldiers who realized too late they had chosen the wrong side. Solin's blaster cracked with flawless precision, each shot punctuated by his muttered announcements of improbable odds. Griv cursed so loudly his voice drowned out the alarms, but every system he touched collapsed under his frantic hacking, opening pathways and shutting down defenses. Together, they carved a path through the chaos, dragging the battle in their favor. In the middle of the storm, Lyra found herself standing over Havoc's body. The once proud senator lay sprawled across the marble floor, his expensive robes darkened with blood, his mouth still twisted in the beginning of a smile that had been cut short. For years, he had played the galaxy like a board game, moving pieces as he pleased, convincing others he was incorruptible. Now the galaxy saw him for what he was, a man undone by greed, arrogance, and the vengeance of the very people he thought powerless. She did not spit on him, nor did she strike him again. His death spoke louder than any insult. Instead, she turned back to the cameras hovering above and addressed the galaxy directly. Her voice was steady, her eyes cold as stone. She told them Havoc had betrayed every treaty, every alliance, every promise of peace. He had kidnapped her son, used the innocent as pawns, and built his empire on lies. She warned that anyone who tried the same would face her. She did not shout. She did not plead. She let the truth hang in the silence, sharp as the edge of her blade. The feed carried across the galaxy, and the reactions were immediate. Some gasped in horror, muttering that she had confirmed the darkest rumors of her past. Others cheered in streets and backroom dens, declaring that the galaxy finally had someone willing to stand against corruption with more than empty words. Senators who had cowered under Havoc's shadow now scrambled to distance themselves from him, some weeping theatrically in front of cameras, others issuing hollow statements about betrayal. None of it mattered. What mattered was that Kale was alive, that the boy who had been stolen from her arms had stood and fought when it mattered most. The galaxy would make its judgments, but Lyra cared for none of them. Her fight had never been for their approval. It had been for her son. The battle within the summit hall dwindled until the last of Havoc's loyalists threw down their weapons and fled. The floor was littered with bodies, both theirs and her own crew's enemies. Jin flicked blood from her blades and muttered that it had been almost too easy, though her smirk betrayed that she was enjoying the aftermath. Solon holstered his blaster with a grin and asked if this meant he could finally collect his winnings, since he had been right about surviving impossible odds. Griv collapsed against a console, groaning that he had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes and demanding a drink strong enough to erase every memory of the night. Even Fesk's trembling voice came through the comms, asking if they were still alive or if he was hallucinating. Lyra let them talk. Their voices, their complaints, even their jokes, those sounds were the reminders that they had survived together, against everything stacked against them. Kale broke the moment of levity when he stood, his expression solemn. He spoke not to her but to everyone gathered. He said the galaxy had seen enough blood, enough lies, enough betrayal from leaders who wore masks of peace while clutching daggers behind their back. He was only a boy, but in that moment, his voice carried the weight of someone far older. He told them he had seen what it meant to be a pawn, and he would not allow anyone else to be used as one. The cadet beside him stood straighter, nodding silently, as if he too had found a new purpose. Lyra's chest ached with pride and fear. Her son was no longer a child. He had stepped into a world she had tried to shield him from, and he was already carrying more than she ever wanted for him. Yet she could not stop him. The galaxy had seen him now. He was part of the story whether either of them wanted it or not. When they finally left the summit, the galaxy was already ablaze with speculation and upheaval. Fleets shifted their allegiances overnight. Treaties once thought fragile were hardened by the revelation of Havoc's corruption. Opponents who had sneered at Lyra in council chambers now spoke her name with fear. And through it all, the story spread like wildfire. The woman who had once slaughtered 7,000 had returned, not for conquest, not for politics, but for her son. It was a warning carried on every channel, whispered in every shadow. No one would dare touch him again. Their freighter drifted quietly away from the summit, battered but intact. Inside, the crew settled into silence, the weight of their survival sinking in. Jin muttered that she would be leaving soon, that their truce was over, though the way her gaze lingered on Lyra suggested a respect that might never fade. Solon sprawled across a crate, flipping his coin with a satisfied smile. Griv was already asleep, grease still smeared across his face. Kale sat beside her, the cadet still close at his side. He leaned against her shoulder, weary but unbroken. She rested her hand over his, feeling the warmth of life she had nearly lost.